All right, so the recording has started. And yeah, once again, thank you for joining the Urban Forest Plan webinar today. My name is Anu, and I'm a planning assistant with the city's environmental sustainability team. And I would like to start by acknowledging that this webinar is being hosted on the traditional and unceded territories of the Squamish and Tsleil-Waututh Nations. The City of North Vancouver is committed to reconciliation with these nations who have lived on these lands since time immemorial. So we are excited to be hosting tonight's webinar to share the Urban Forest Plan project. And before we get started, we just have a few housekeeping items to go through. So once again, this webinar is recorded and it will be posted on the city's website afterwards as a resource. And during this webinar, cameras, microphones will remain off and your name and email will be hidden from other attendees. If you have issues with your audio during the webinar, you can use your phone to dial in to the phone number and meeting code, which are on the screen, as well as in the email invitation. And this webinar will have a presentation to explain the project and purpose of the Urban Forest Plan, the data we've collected as part of the State of the Urban Forest Report, and then next steps. So then after the presentation, we'll then have a Q&A. So please submit any questions you have as they come in using the Q&A function. And please select the presenter and host option. If you have issues accessing the Q&A, you can also email questions to urbanforest@cnv.org. And so now I'd like to introduce our presenter, Amelia Nidova. Amelia is the principal and senior forester at Diamond Head Consulting, who we're working with to develop our urban forest plan. And we're very excited to hear from her expertise tonight. And with that, I'll turn it over to you, Amelia.
Thank you, Anu, and welcome everybody, and thanks for joining us to learn more about the City of North Vancouver's Urban Forest Plan. I will be presenting this evening on a few topics, the first being to provide an overview of the Urban Forest Plan project in terms of its timeline and scope, and then talk a bit about defining the urban forest and what it is to the City of North Vancouver and why we really need to have trees in our cities and in our urban areas. I'm then going to cover the State of the Urban Forest report, and that report is available publicly on the city's Let's Talk webpage now, and so you can download that and read it for more details, but I'm going to cover this evening the key findings from that report, and then provide a bit of a preview of some of the indicators and the challenges and opportunities that the Urban Forest Plan itself is going to address. And then finally, I'll touch on the next steps in terms of this community engagement phase and the additional opportunities there will be for input moving forward once the draft plan is released. So just to explain initially how our project is structured, we're developing the Urban Forest Plan over 4 separate tasks. We've completed the first 2 tasks, which covered the background research and review. So that's speaking with staff and learning about the organisation and its urban forest management program, and looking at policies that regulate trees in the city. And then we undertook an inventory mapping and analysis phase as well. And that all of the culmination of those 2 tasks is included in the State of the Urban Forest report. We're now in phase 1 of community engagement on that report. And this engagement phase is quite broad, seeking input that's going to help us develop the vision for the plan and understand the community's values and priorities for urban forest management. There will be a second phase of engagement as well once the draft plan is released, and that plan's in the fall, is for the fall of 2024. And then we're hoping to finalise the Urban Forest Plan itself in the winter of this year. So there are 2 main outcomes of our project, and the first is the State of the Urban Forest report that this presentation is based on. So that report provides more of the historical context of the urban forest, the trends that we've seen over time, and sets some benchmarks. So those benchmarks are metrics that we're going to establish today and will help us track our progress moving forward as the Urban Forest Plan is implemented. And then the Urban Forest Plan itself is the key deliverable of this project, and that is going to contain the recommendations with an action plan that includes the priorities for implementation, the timing and the costing, and really establishes the roadmap for moving forward with urban forest management for the city. So what do we mean when we talk about the urban forest? So for the City of North Vancouver, this means all of the trees and supporting vegetation in the community. And that is also recognising that the urban forest is interconnected. It includes and depends on the soil, water and air that nourish trees, and it can't exist without them. So when we think about the urban forest, it's quite a holistic definition. And we can see from the diagram at the bottom here that the urban forest and the trees that are within it grow in a really wide range of environments, from the very sort of urban waterfront and urban centre and commercial areas into the more sort of residential private yard trees, and then our parklands, which include our forests and riparian areas. So trees are growing in a really diverse range of settings, and in our urban areas, we manage our trees quite intensively. We have to often construct and create space for trees to grow in urban areas. We need to maintain them for clearance. They're really treated as individuals, individual assets that we take care of. And then in our forest areas, we do less intensive management there because those forests can tend to regenerate themselves, but we might need to step in to remove invasive species or to underplant in certain areas or address forest health concerns or wildfire concerns in those areas. So the plan will really cover the scope of the different needs that tree management has in the city. And why do we do this? Really, urban forestry is focused on how we can maximise the benefits of trees in urban areas and minimise the risks. And so research is increasingly showing just the myriad of benefits that trees provide to urban environments. And this diagram represents a broad range of these in a street cross-section sense. And so there's benefits that we commonly think of in terms of providing habitat and biodiversity, but also urban forests and green infrastructure are really important as tools to help us both mitigate to climate change because they store and sequester carbon, but also to adapt because they provide shade to reduce the heating and cooling needs of our buildings. They also improve the quality of life for residents who live in cities. And there's a lot of knock-on effects in relation to public health, in relation to stress reduction that having trees in cities can bring. And I'll touch on some of those benefits in a bit more detail. So habitat is a really critical one because the urban forests and the natural areas that we have in cities, they really provide the habitat for the wildlife in our cities, in and amongst our human habitats. And the matrix of trees in between our urban areas provides connectivity between those natural habitats as well. Trees are home to birds, they're home to bats and many other types of small mammals, but they're also important forage for bees and other pollinators. And in our retained forest areas, those become increasingly critical for habitat for animals like bats, where they require large old trees with hollows, and there are fewer and fewer of those in our urban environments. So where those do exist inside our parklands, those larger, older trees are really critical for providing habitat for bat colonies and other animals that depend on that type of habitat. Trees also help capture and slow rainwater, and I'm sure that everyone has had that experience of sheltering under the canopy of a tree when it starts to rain, or being able to enjoy a walk in the forest even when it is raining because that tree canopy is intercepting and slowing the drips. And in a forest setting, once water does reach the ground, the understory and the soil tend to absorb most of that. So there's very little runoff from natural forest areas. And instead, that water tends to run below ground and eventually into our streams. And as that water moves through soil, it's filtered and it's cleaned. So by the time it runs into a waterway, that water and that runoff is very clean. But by contrast, our urban areas tend to contain a lot of hard surfaces. And so when the rainwater hits those hard surfaces, instead of being absorbed, it runs off over the surface. And as it travels, it picks pollutants up from roadways and then flows into pipes where it's delivered directly into waterways. So instead of that water entering clean, it's often more polluted. But we can improve how rainwater is managed in urban areas, and the urban forest is an important part of that. For example, by using rain gardens and bioswales, often those can include trees as well. You kind of mimic the forest soils because the soils in those systems filter and clean the water before it enters the pipes. Another critical element, though, is that having those retained trees and forests around our riparian areas is really important for maintaining stream health and fish habitat. And that's because the tree roots that grow in the ravines and in adjacent to stream areas, they prevent erosion and they slow down the runoff, and that protects the clean water that salmon need to survive in particular. Fallen trees adjacent to our waterways also create pools that shelter young fish and protect them from currents. And they also provide shade, which helps to regulate the temperature of stream water. And that's really critical for salmon and fish survival as well. So the urban forest, again, a really critical part of many elements of our natural world, even though we're living in these urbanized areas. Trees are also critically important for cooling. And many of you probably experienced the 2021 heat wave, which tragically resulted in more than 600 deaths from the 2 heat wave events that happened in that year. Now that event, in addition to the impact it had on people, really overwhelmed our emergency systems as well. And at the peak of this event, there were emergency calls that were going unresponded to because so many people were directed. So there's been a lot of analysis since this heatwave event. A recent economic assessment found that avoiding the heatwave deaths that occurred would have had an economic value of 5.5 billion based on the value of statistical life. That report also found that the healthcare costs from the heatwave amounted to $12 million from that event. And most of the people who died or who were unwell during that heat wave were exposed to extreme temperatures in their homes because they didn't have mechanical cooling, but they also died more often in areas that had lots of paved surfaces and concrete and a real lack of tree cover. And those were often also socially and materially deprived neighbourhoods. So the BC Coroner's Report and the Extreme Heat Death Review Panel Report both found that declining tree canopy and permeable surfaces in urban areas would increase our vulnerability to extreme heat. So it's really quite an imperative that we move forward with urban planning that incorporates both tree canopy and permeable surfaces, especially in our dense neighbourhoods where a lot of people are living. Urban forests and green spaces also encourage social cohesion and community belonging. And these have knock-on effects for our public health as well. So our green spaces are central points for social interaction, and they foster a sense of community among people and bring together people from diverse backgrounds in our community. They also provide a setting for community events and for recreational activities or informal gatherings. And this accessibility really helps to build relationships among neighbours, and it creates a stronger sense of belonging and community connection as well. And research into this indicates that urban forests have a real calming effect on individuals. They help reduce stress, they help promote mental health and well-being. And this can translate into more positive interactions between community members as well. And then spending that time and walking and living in and amongst trees and green spaces also provides really, really large public health benefits. So research has found that people who live in locations with more tree canopy tend to live longer and they're healthier on average. And there was a recent study from California that was really interesting. They tracked 5 million people who were registered with a healthcare provider there. And through that study, they found that people with the fewest neighbourhood trees had a higher rate of disease and incurred about $370 more medical costs per year than people who lived in the greenest neighbourhoods. And that's correcting for all the other factors involved. So that's really, they isolated the impact of greenness. And they, at a whole study level, they said that the participants who lived in the most barren areas ended up spending about $194 million more that could potentially be avoided in their annual medical costs. So again, really compelling reasons why having trees and having green space in and amongst our cities is critically important. So now I'll share some of the results that we found from the State of the Urban Forest report. Canopy cover is a term that you'll see repeated through the State of the Urban Forest report. It's going to come up in the Urban Forest Plan as well. So what is it? Canopy cover is a metric that lots of cities use because it's quite easily measured and it's quite repeatable and comparable between cities and between land uses, and it's not the only thing that's important about the urban forest, but it is one of the more easily communicated metrics and easily tracked ones as well. So the canopy cover is really talking about what the two-dimensional extent of the tree canopy is when viewed from above. You can see it more easily in this map on the right. Essentially, we're capturing an outline of every tree that is in the city, and we're using that to establish how much of the land surface is covered with trees. The process for deriving this tree canopy cover map involves the use of LiDAR, which is collected from a plane that flies and sends down a laser pulse to the Earth's surface, and it creates a three-dimensional map of the ground surface below. And we combine that LiDAR information with ortho imagery, and the ortho imagery gives us a color signature. So what we did in this case is we combined those two data sets, and we used a machine learning algorithm that could segment the land surface into different sort of categories of similarity. And then there's an algorithm that detects which of those segments are trees and which are not. And then we go through a couple of additional steps and some manual cleaning to get to the point where we have a very precise and accurate map of the tree canopy. And along with this two-dimensional information, because it's LiDAR and it's got a three-dimensional quality, we can also get a sense of canopy height and canopy volume from this data set as well. So it's quite a powerful tool. So this is what that canopy cover map looks like at the whole city scale. And you can see the canopy is sort of distributed in these larger forested areas, and then in and amongst the urban matrix, we have many individual trees as well. Approximately 40% of the city's canopy cover is in these natural and semi-natural forests that range in age from sort of young to mature, as shown on this map. But the remainder, which is the remaining 60%, is found in those trees that exist within the urban matrix, in streets, in yards, and in landscape parks and other land uses. In terms of who manages the canopy, we've broken it out in this graph by these land cover types. About 35% of the tree canopy is on land that is privately managed, and the remainder, the majority, is on city managed land. So about 38% is managed in parks, 25% is over roads, and 2% is on other types of city land. And it's an interesting contrast because while more of the tree canopy is on public land, more of the actual land base is under private management. So that does present opportunities to consider how we might be able to increase the proportion of canopy that's on private land as well. Some of the key findings from the State of the Urban Forest report were that the tree canopy cover has remained quite stable since 2007 at 20%. So that was quite an interesting finding, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. And there's quite a detailed map in the State of the Urban Forest report that shows both that canopy cover stability, but also that it's been dynamic and we've seen change as well. We also found that the tree canopy was not evenly distributed across the city. So you probably saw that from the canopy cover map itself, but when we look at it by neighbourhood, by land use, there's a lot of differences between the areas with the highest and lowest tree canopy. We also looked at the forest structure and saw that large mature trees provide significant value and contribute significantly to the city's current canopy cover. And we identified that the urban forest is facing increased stress due to a number of factors, some of those key ones being extreme heat and drought. And then the report provides a bit more detail and context to these, but I'll touch briefly on each of these points as well. So we used a hex grid to provide a summary view of the canopy at a slightly bigger scale. It's a little bit sort of easier to see. And we also created a map using this same scale to show where there'd been change in terms of gain and loss. So although we've had stability and that 20% canopy cover has been pretty stable since 2007, and we look at these individual hex grids, there actually has been areas where we've seen gain and where we've seen loss. So we're seeing gain in areas where there's been street tree planting, or in parks where canopy has grown, or in development sites where canopy has grown. We're also seeing loss where recent development has occurred, and in some cases a transfer of canopy from what was on a private parcel into, say, the roadway adjacent to development. So it's important to remember when we're thinking about how we set canopy cover targets in the future, what is the type of change we're anticipating? If we want to maintain stability, well, we need to ensure that we're compensating for the tree canopy that's removed in that time period. If we want to grow the canopy cover, we need to make sure that we're planting more and we're more than compensating for canopy loss so that we can see that canopy cover grow. So canopy cover isn't evenly distributed, as we noted, and this distribution is often a function of sort of historic land use as well as the current land use that exists in an area. So some of the neighbourhoods that are shown on this graph and on the map have large areas of forested park, and that really bumps their overall canopy cover up. Other neighbourhoods are more residential and maybe have more space for trees on the private land, whereas other land uses such as Moodyville and Lower Lonsdale, they have areas that have been, historically under industrial or light industrial use, and so they haven't had historic tree canopy, and their tree canopy cover is low today, but is likely to be increasing because they've been seeing a lot of new plantings as well in some of these locations. So while the average is 20%, you can see that the neighbourhoods really vary in and around that average, with some having a lot more and some having a lot less tree canopy. So through the strategy, we'll also be looking at the neighbourhoods and the different land uses and how canopy cover is distributed to really think about the types of policy we need to influence canopy cover moving forward. Some of the other factors that we're interested in focus on how we would prioritise tree planting. So on this map here is showing the population density by census block. And then there's little black lines around the blocks that have less than 10% canopy cover as well. And then on the right, we're showing the canopy cover map. And you can see that looking at between these two data sets, areas with the lowest canopy cover are often correlated with the areas of higher density as well. And so that helps us understand where we have a lot of people living, and we might need to match increased canopy cover at the block scale with these particular city blocks to make sure we're able to deliver the benefits needed. Similarly, we can look at land surface temperature by census block as well. This land surface temperature map was derived from satellite data that was taken during that 2021 heatwave event. It was taken in the evening, and it shows which city blocks were the hottest and which were the coolest. And again, looking at this map in contrast to the tree canopy map, we can see that the areas of low tree canopy cover tend to be the hottest as well. And that to the exclusion of where these city blocks are in proximity to water, that water is also having a cooling effect. So we do see some low canopy areas near the water where the temperatures are cooler. But if we bring together the land surface temperature, the population density, and our canopy map, it really helps highlight the specific blocks where we need to increase tree canopy cover. We also studied the structure of the forest from the LiDAR information. So we were able to see where in the city were the largest canopy, tallest trees. When we looked at the distribution of tree size and canopy cover together, we could see that even though the city has a lot of young or small trees, the larger trees are providing a really significant portion of the canopy area. So that really speaks to the fact that we need to, wherever possible, retain those large trees because they are such important contributors to tree canopy cover, but as well, they're really important for provision of benefits. And so large trees, they provide more benefits than small trees, and that's because they have larger canopies and larger leaf areas, so they're able to absorb, to capture more pollutants, to capture more rainwater, produce more air cleaning benefits. And so large trees, from that perspective, are something we really try to prioritize wherever possible. But the other reason that large trees are so important in urban forestry is that they tend to be long-lived. So where a small tree lives for, say, 30 or 40 years, a large tree can live for hundreds of years. In urban areas, their life expectancy tends to be lower. It tends to be more like 100 years at the best, in the best outcome. But if we think about it from an asset management perspective, if we can plant one tree that's going to be large at maturity and live in the landscape for 100 years, our maintenance and replacement costs are going to be much lower than if we have to plant the equivalent of 7 to 12 small trees and we have to replace them every 30 years. So really, we want to have a two-pronged approach here where we retain large trees wherever we possibly can, but we also want to create conditions that will support medium to large trees as opposed to many small trees in the city, because that's how we're really going to have a more sustainable urban forest over the long term. So in addition to canopy cover, there'll be some other indicators that we'll be looking at in terms of benchmarking and looking at progress moving forward. So we'll continue to track the age and height because that gives us important information about the structure of the urban forest and how sustainable it is. We'll also track species diversity in the inventory tree population. So species diversity, it's not something we consider so much for the native forests, but it is more important for our planted urban forests. And that's because we don't want to have too much of any single species or genus, basically type of tree. So a good example is the emerald ash borer is an insect that is attacking ash trees. So if our population was too dominated by ash and emerald ash borer arrived, we would lose a really significant proportion of our population. And there's a number of pests like that. There's the Dutch elm disease. There's also the Asian longhorn beetle. These are insects and diseases that can have devastating effects on a particular type of tree. So species diversity is important to make sure that the urban forest population is not vulnerable to any single pest or disease, and that we'll be able to still maintain a canopy cover, again, over the long term. We also want to look at connectivity because that's important for biodiversity and the ability for animals and for insects to move between habitats in our urban areas. So connectivity is important, certainly for our natural areas, but even our urban trees and our yards and our landscaping can provide some connectivity for biodiversity through more urbanized locations that can help improve, again, the biodiversity of our natural areas as well. The Urban Forest Plan also has to address some of the really significant challenges that we're facing today. In terms of forest health, our region has experienced some impacts from extended sort of seasonal droughts and heats where we've seen western red cedar particularly negatively impacted and a lot of die-off in our natural areas. We've also had the hemlock looper outbreak. Now, although the hemlock looper is a native insect and it does cyclically outbreak every 15 to 20 years, it had a more severe impact in this last year because it happened on the heels of this extreme heat event. So where trees might usually be able to recover from the defoliation by the looper, instead a lot more trees died than they usually would have. And these are things we need to keep in mind moving forward. How can we help our natural systems be more resilient to these types of challenges? And what kinds of species of trees do we need to be planting, or genetics of trees do we need to be planting in our natural areas to make them more resilient? That is related to climate change, but climate change also brings other challenges in relation to extreme weather, water shortages, and these are things that affect both our natural and our natural forest areas as well as our managed urban trees. So in order to make our trees more resilient and to make them essentially part of our also adaptation strategy as well, we need these trees to be healthy. So there are a number of strategies we need to consider in terms of making our trees more resilient to climate change and extreme weather. We're also going to have ongoing urbanisation and development. And that does present both challenges and opportunities, because through landscaping standards, we can incorporate trees into areas where they maybe didn't exist before, or replace tree canopy that has been removed from as a result of development. At the same time, in certain areas, trees will have to be removed to accommodate development. So we're going to have to look at the push and pull in relation to urbanisation development and understand how to essentially maximise our opportunities that come through it. Urban forest program capacity is another area that we're going to look at. So that's really the staffing, the funding that's available to manage the urban forest and to implement the plan as well. And for many cities, that's becoming an increasing demand on their urban forest capacity. And a lot of that's because of climate change and extreme weather. But it's also because of the identified need for trees and green spaces in urban areas. And as our areas become more urbanized, the proximity of trees to buildings, to hardscape, to utilities increases. And that increases the cost of management and increases the cost of tree planting. So all of this needs to be factored in to the plan that we will develop. And then finally, biodiversity and habitat fragmentation. These are also elements we need to consider, definitely for our semi-natural and natural forest areas, but even also in our urban areas. How can we enhance biodiversity? How can we enhance connectivity to reduce the impacts of the fragmentation and biodiversity loss that has occurred prior to this time? So the city already is doing quite a lot of work in urban forest management. And so this plan will be building on that, so seeking to really strengthen the work that has been done and seek to identify the opportunities to improve things further. So the city has a number of initiatives, including the Living City Tree Planting Program that's really enhancing the planting in the city's streetscapes, the Park Stewardship Program, which is promoting community involvement in parkland settings, the Community Wildfire Protection Plan that's looking at wildfire risk, and the Hemlock Looper Moth Program has been one that's been operating in response to that recent outbreak. That will not need to continue because the Looper Moth outbreak is largely complete, but it certainly has a little more work to do to complete its work. And then some of the opportunities that we'll be looking to build on will be establishing canopy cover targets. So those will look at a citywide target, but we'll also look at targets by different scales. So it could be by neighbourhood or by land use. We'll seek to identify targets that are aspirational, but that are achievable. And then we'll also be identifying what needs to happen in order for those targets to be achieved. We'll also look at what capacity needs to be built in order to implement the urban forest plan. We'll look at expanding the planting programs that do exist, but also looking at how we can improve the standards that guide tree planting that occurs in the city today, whether that's done by the city or a private entity. Also, we'll be focusing on improving management standards through documentation and by building up a proactive maintenance program. So currently, a lot of the maintenance of trees in the cities is done reactively. So if someone calls in because there's a problem, whereas proactive maintenance looks at how we can cyclically prune trees from when they're young to prevent bigger issues once they get older. And once you implement programs like that, well, the idea is that over time you'll have less reactive management, fewer issues called in, fewer large tree failures, and just in general, more healthy, resilient trees that can tolerate storms and that don't have a lot of deadwood or other defects. And importantly, we'll also be looking to expand partnerships and engagement. And because a lot of the city's land base is under private management, people have a really important role to play in the urban forest and in the urban forest plan. That's whether it's volunteering their time to enhance trees and urban forests on public land, or doing something on their own property or a friend's property to plant a tree or care for a tree. So in terms of our next steps, just a quick revisit on the timeline here. We'll be wrapping up this first phase of community engagement in the coming month, and then we'll be moving into drafting the urban forest plan. And that will come back to the community, hopefully in the fall of 2024, with the aim of completing the plan entirely by the end of this year. The purpose of the engagement we're doing now is to understand and to be able to articulate the community's vision, values and priorities, so that it's not a plan in our words, but it's a plan that's written in the words of the community. We also want to learn from the community and share information about the urban forest with our community. The second phase of engagement is more about presenting the plan and what's in it, and asking people to provide feedback on the draft and the recommendations. So there's a range of engagement opportunities that are currently available, and they're all posted on the city's Let's Talk website that's linked here. There's an online survey which I hope you'll participate in if you haven't already. And there's also several pop-ups planned at the Skate Plaza in the shipyards over the coming weekends. And there is also another one at the City Library next Wednesday from 2:30 to 5 p.m. You can also connect with staff via email at the urbanforest@cnv.org email address. So with that, I thank you for your attention, and I look forward to any questions that you might have. Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you so much, Amelia, for that wonderful presentation. And thank you everyone for coming to the presentation as well. So just before we start the Q&A, I'm going to end this recording, but please remember that this recording will be available on the city's webpage for a future resource, so you can always refer back to it.